Ladies and gentlemen, this is G-Rex and this is D-Day, La Resistance by the channel Extra Credits. This is Extra History Part 3. Yeah, I've read to the first two parts. D-Day is awesome. This, the way this channel is, covering it, it's really good. It's not just simply, the attack and so forth. No, all the things around it. First episode saw, how, Normandy, attack on Normandy came to be and how it didn't go as planned. The second part saw how all the, all the spy shit and everything, how they orchestrated everything, how many people were involved in that. That was just awesome. All the fake armies, fake tanks and everything. In this, I guess we're gonna see how people put up resistance, La Resistance. So maybe this is gonna be fun. Remember, well, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the reaction. There's a link in the description. Check out the cards for different playlists like history with all my historical videos from this channel and others too. All Escalation program with all their videos. Internet historian, CGP Grey, Tier Zoo. Yeah, let's do this one.
June 5th, 1944. A group of French farmers huddle around a radio tuned to the London broadcast. If they're caught, they will be thrown in prison, perhaps tortured, perhaps even executed. But they listen anyway. And then they hear it. A single line from a French poem tossed in amongst 100 nonsense phrases disguised as personal messages. A cheer goes up, and the farmers grab their guns. That was their signal. The liberation starts tonight. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. 4 years before the Normandy beach landings, the French government signed an armistice that turned all of northern France into a Nazi-occupied zone. They insisted that surrender was the only way to save their people from being crushed by the unstoppable German war machine. But from the first moment that German army boots...
I know people like to, make fun of the French people like that. Oh, cheese-eating surrender monkeys or whatever the phrase is. Yeah, but, in World War I, there are lots of elite and veterans died in the trench warfares. World War II, just few decades after, all the events that led to it, if they had not surrendered, just kept on, they would have gone crushed even more badly before they would have to, surrender anyway. So I guess, this was understandable what they did here.
Marched down the streets of Paris, resistance groups began to spring up all over France. The early resistance groups were small, disorganized, and independent. They had enthusiasm, but no direction, other than a burning desire to kick the Germans out of their country. And there were not many of them. Most citizens chose to put their...
Oh god, I remember that game, Saboteur. I loved that game so much because it was, guns, cars, and battling Nazis. But it also had the, climbing buildings type of thing, Assassin's Creed type of thing, built into it. That opened, so many possibilities. It created a three-dimensional plane to play at, right? I remember jumping from buildings to buildings and, doing things that is just unique. And it felt, rewarding. Like, look at that. What I did was just awesome. Because usual mission leads you in one way. Like, you should do it like this. Here's a building you need to infiltrate. But no, you could do it many ways. Something that, game probably doesn't realize that you can do. Like, jumping a long distance from rooftop to rooftop. That, it feels like this is not how the game was intended. But still, it's a free open world game. You can do it. And it's just awesome all the time. And the game was so awesome. The music, the soundtrack, the ending mission, while you walk all the way in the top of the Eiffel Tower while the piano plays, feeling good, that music is just awesome, the whole game. Only thing I didn't like how, before you liberate a place, it was all black and white. You have to liberate it to make it into color. I didn't like that. But the game as a whole was just extraordinarily great. So, this reminded me that, Nazi-occupied France, resistance movements, that's what we are, resistance in the game. So, yeah, it was great. It was made by Pandemic Studios, I guess. And EA being an asshole, shut down the studio later on, so there was no follow-up game after that. But that game was so awesome. I'm pretty sure anybody who played it just loved it. It didn't have the mixed reviews. Even if you go right now on Google and search that game, it has the, I guess, mostly positive reviews.
Faith in what remained of the French government, which had fled south to the city of Vichy. They claimed to control unoccupied southern France, but really they just did whatever the Germans told them to do. The early resistance lashed out by attempting to hurt or even kill German soldiers, but all they really managed to do was provoke vengeance. Hitler ordered the mass execution and deportation of several thousand French Jews and communists in retaliation for strikes made by the early resistance groups. The message was clear: if you hurt our people, we will hurt yours more. The resistance needed to find ways...
I mean, that makes sense, what Guy did in Poland. I mean, obviously this would happen if you show any resistance. The guy does not give an F. He'll probably kill a lot more of your people.
To fight back without inviting retribution and making things worse. And things had gotten pretty bad. By now, the German war machine, which had ground up the French armies in less than 6 weeks, had a desperate need for natural resources and industrial power, two things that France had in abundance. They imposed tight rations on their French subjects and began redirecting all the wealth of France to fuel their conquering army. So that became the new resistance target: take out the factories and the railroads so that the Germans couldn't use them anymore. As long as they didn't harm any Germans doing it, the harshest reprisals never came. The British had that same idea. They parachuted a...
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. During this time, Nazis were running out of resources. That was one of the main reasons they took France to begin with. All the factories and things. So at that same time, if you take out all the factories, railroad, you're literally crippling Nazi forces. So when the Allied forces do attack, Nazis are not as strong as before. But I'm surprised that Hitler didn't, retaliate even stronger. I mean, like he said, if you kill Nazi soldiers and things, Hitler will retaliate. But isn't, destroying all these factories and, railroads and whatever, doesn't that Hitler see as, crippling Nazis anyway? I was surprised that Hitler was like, oh, at least they didn't kill our soldiers. I'm surprised Hitler went like that.
Agents into France to begin forming resistance networks of their own, recruiting citizens they could trust, and sometimes linking up with existing groups if they could find them. One of those agents would have a radio that could transmit messages back to London, requesting supply drops with weapons and explosives so that the resistance could get to work. But radios powerful enough to transmit across the channel were in pretty short supply. So they turned to Radio London, a public French-language station that had been created specifically to counter German propaganda and organize protests from safely across the English Channel. Radio London began to open and conclude every program with a nonsensical jumble of phrases that it called personal messages, which were actually coded messages for the resistance. The radio operators hiding in France would contact British headquarters with the requested supply drop and give them a random phrase like, "Pierre says hello." Then, instead of resistance members coming back to the safe house for updates every night, they could just listen at home on their radios. If Pierre said hello, they would head to their prearranged drop point. This radio system, the same one that would be used on D-Day to call the Normandy resistance cells to action, was operated by yet another group devoted to the liberation of France, the Free French. Back when the Germans had taken over northern France, a little-known general by the name of Charles de Gaulle escaped across the Channel to England. He had been appointed to government office only 12 days before, but now found himself faced with the prospect of watching his country, and the government he was supposed to serve, surrender to Germany. De Gaulle would not have it. He got on the British radio and called for all of France to rise up and fight. He invited all the soldiers who had fled from the invading Germans to join him now in London to regroup and take their country back. And he vowed to keep speaking on the radio so that those who couldn't leave France would know that the flame of French resistance still burned bright. Inspiring words, but very few people heard them. Most French people weren't exactly in the habit of listening to British radio broadcasts at this point, but those who did began to spread the word. Of 100,000 French soldiers who had escaped to Britain, 7,000 decided to stay with de Gaulle. It was small, but it was a start. And with that start, de Gaulle vowed to take France back from the Germans and the Vichy government that had surrendered to them. He knew that a small force couldn't accomplish that task on its own. He needed to win support from Great Britain and the United States, and he needed to coordinate the scattered groups of the French resistance. Both would prove very difficult. Winston Churchill recognized de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French Resistance group, but he balked at acknowledging him to be the leader of France itself. After all, de Gaulle had never actually been elected leader of France, and now here he was trying to claim the right to lead a country that he couldn't even set foot in because its official government had sentenced him to death. To make matters worse, de Gaulle had a habit of rubbing President Roosevelt of the United States exactly the wrong way. But that same arrogance that drove Roosevelt away also proved to be the fire that de Gaulle had promised to keep burning for France. Piece by piece, he built a government.
In the end, look, guerrilla warfare is one of the biggest nuisance for anyone, right? So that is really important. Resistance movement is really, really important. And this guy actually, keeping resistant members' morale up is really important here as well. I mean, I don't get it. His country is occupied by Nazis and he's, pissing off US presidents. I mean, come on, man. This is not the time to make enemies.
Government in exile, appealing to both generals and bureaucrats to abandon the Vichy government and join his cause instead. Because of his determination to push himself forward as the true leader of France, he forced the Allies to treat France as an ongoing partner in the war effort, and not as a defunct and conquered nation, like so many others under the German thumb. By 1942, 2 years before the landings at Normandy, his efforts had begun to bear fruit. He had appointed a leader to coordinate the French resistance cells on his behalf, and succeeded in forming a central committee that pledged its loyalty to him. British agents began to coordinate their own resistance efforts with de Gaulle's Free French, although they didn't trust him entirely. They did keep a few of their networks secret from him. Nevertheless, they worked together to create a detailed set of plans to support the upcoming Allied invasion. They would target crucial railroads, telephone systems, and electrical installations to sabotage the Germans' ability to mobilize their defenses once the Allies landed. And that once small resistance movement had grown enormously over the 4 years of occupation. Now, over 100,000 combatants stood ready with weapons and explosives that had been parachuted in by drops coordinated through radio.
So basically, a French army obviously got crushed by Nazis. This resistance movement became the French army, right? I mean, all the countries that were, taken over by Nazis were, I guess immobilized, you could say. They were out of the picture for the actual, Allied forces. But they kept France as an active member because of this, because they are going to attack from France, from Normandy Beach, right? So resistance movement active members who are actually resisting Nazis inside France is really important. They could cripple Nazis' movements, all the factories, railroads, so Nazis cannot be at full power when they retaliate back. So that was really important, and apparently, like the message said, these people also fought alongside the Allied forces at the beaches.
London. The Allies and the Free French had pushed back on German control in the wider French Empire, winning massive victories in the French colonies of North Africa, and proving that a properly organized French army could indeed stand up to the German war machine. The Germans responded to that success by reaching for more control of France itself. They ended any pretense of the Vichy government's independence and overran the southern countryside, which only alienated more French people and bolstered recruitment for the resistance. But Germany's greatest gifts to the resistance were the invasion of Russia and the subsequent labor draft in France. When the Germans broke their uneasy truce with Russia,
yeah, see, when the Nazis that's a Vichy government, this is Nazi-occupied France, that was the, treaty they signed when France surrendered. Now Nazis like, fuck that, entire France is ours. If people are not going to join resistance, now they will, because they're like, okay, Hitler is way too volatile than before. He can do anything. He can round us all up and kill tomorrow. So we have to do this now. So this is just going to, flame the fire, I guess.
They galvanized the many communist groups in France to take up arms against them. These brand new resistance groups never entirely accepted the leadership of the Free French or the British agents, but they were well organized in their independence and made good use of the supplies those agents gave them. Meanwhile, to compensate for the men they had sent away to fight on the Eastern Front with Russia, Germany began to draft young Frenchmen to serve as forced labor in the cogs of their machine. Many fled the draft by running to the only group in France that would fight for their freedom, the Resistance. So when Resistance members gathered around their radios on June the 5th and finally heard the signal words that meant the liberation was on its way, they celebrated and then they got to work. In the span of a single day, they took down 577 railroads, 30 driving roads, and 32 telecommunications sites. They cut off several panzer divisions from moving north to join the German defense
Yeah, I remember, the game I talked about, Saboteur. In that's what you mostly do, blow up shit. This is that, I guess.
force, giving the Allies precious time to establish a beachhead before German reinforcements could arrive. And together with ordinary French citizens, many of whom now flooded to join the resistance in such numbers that the Allies didn't have enough weapons to supply them, they helped guide and support the paratroopers to strike key targets and begin dismantling German control of France. For all of the struggle, all of the setbacks, and yes, even the surrender that France faced, it was as de Gaulle predicted in that fateful radio address that first brought together the forces of the Free French. But has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final? No. Thanks again.
I mean, all the places Nazis took over, right? None of them were as major country as France, right? I'm pretty sure. I mean, in the past, who are the major powers? I mean, Prussia, major power. Russia, major power. France, major power. UK, major power. So basically, none of them were as a major power as France. When they took on France and France surrendered, that was like, oh, look at that, France surrendered. But obviously, they are going to be like, fuck that. We are not going, under Nazi's thumb. So there were resistance movement, obviously. And, there were, people like de Gaulle, I guess, amping everybody up, like, keep the France alive, this and that. So it's not so easy to just, I guess, take over France and, keep it under, your thumb like that. I mean, you need years, you need more manpower if you want to do that, but it still would be hard. So yeah, damn, that was an awesome video. Alright people, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, check out the reaction, this link in the description, check out the cards, please check out the end cards, and I'll see you next time.